All right, peace, family. This is Dayvon Love, Director of Public Policy, Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. We're going to be co-hosting today with the illustrious Dr. Khalilah Harris. I'm going to do a more full intro of Dr. Harris in a few moments. What I want to first do is just talk a little bit about LBS and our approach to legislative advocacy, because that's going to be really important in terms of the context of our conversation. As many of you probably know, LBS, we're a grassroots political think tank, an advocacy organization. And so our ultimate kind of political worldview is rooted in the importance of Black liberation and African sovereignty and self-determination. And we see legislative advocacy as one of many tools toward that end. And that's important because when we think about the way that some people engage the political and legislative process, those of us that have more radical political sensibilities are clear that these are just tools, and that the ultimate goal is for us to build what is necessary for Black people to navigate the society in a way that advances our interests towards collective freedom and Black liberation. So that's really the frame that we come from as an organization, from our legislative advocacy and efforts. And we collaborate with a variety of people that are engaged in policy work that benefits Black people more generally. Streets to the Statehouse was something that we started last session. As people who are familiar with LBS, we would send out legislative updates, and we partner with many organizations that send out newsletters to talk to people about what's happening during the Maryland General Assembly. And so we thought that it would make sense to do a podcast last session. And it was mostly myself just kind of talking about LBS's legislative priorities. And we thought it was good in terms of informing the community about what we're doing. So this will be our second year doing it during the Maryland General Assembly. And of course, we're in a global pandemic. So a lot of things have gone virtual, but the session is still going on, and there's still a lot of things to be talked about and addressed. And some of the feedback we got from last time was that, folks wanted something more conversational. So we thought long and hard, because like I said, we have a lot of partners that engage in legislative work in Annapolis. But we wanted to make sure that we were able to have a conversation with someone who has a wide range of understanding of a variety of different policy issues. And so we landed at our friend, Dr. Khalilah Harris, as someone who is both knowledgeable about the local political landscape, both as a matter of politics and policy, and also has a lot of national policy background and experience. So I'll let Dr. Khalilah Harris introduce herself to the podcast, and then we'll jump into some of the items on the agenda tonight.
All right, I'm going to keep my glasses off because I'm getting a glare, and I want you all to see the intensity of my eyes when I'm giving a read on elected officials who are not working on our behalf. I'm Dr. Khalilah Harris. I am the Managing Director of K-12 Education Policy for the Center for American Progress. I'm also a non-resident senior fellow with the Maryland Center on Economic Policy. Some of you may know me from local organizing as it relates to ensuring all students have access to the types of school buildings that ensure we tell our children that we love them, and that our educators, we take them seriously as professionals. You may have seen me around the Statehouse a bit, either with my sorority sisters of Alpha Kappa Alpha, or just simply advocating on issues like ensuring our HBCUs are treated fairly and equitably by the state of Maryland. And you may also see me on national television on MSNBC discussing national politics. So, I'm from the streets to the Statehouse. I'm from the streets to the Capitol building, but I'm definitely from the streets. So let's get going.
All right. I like that. So let's so before we jump into some of the particulars, one of the things, and I started to talk about it a little earlier. There's a lot of attention that's given in kind of mainstream corporate media to national politics, and that's important. There's a role for national politics and the policies that are pertinent to that. For us, we find it particularly important to talk about state level policy because there's such a huge vacuum, particularly as it relates to issues facing Black people in the Statehouse that focus directly on that. There are a variety of news outlets. There's some podcasts and some reporting and some commentary that's done just kind of broadly of the Maryland General Assembly. One of the things that we found just as we began to get acclimated to the work of legislative advocacy in the Statehouse, we recognized just how much distance there is between what the general public and the community knows about what's happening in the Statehouse and what's actually happening. And I think a part of, particularly why it's important is because many of the policies that people think about as important bread and butter issues, impact people's lives. So for instance, one of the things I actually saw years ago, there was somebody who was running for office, and they were at a convening, and they were yelling at the mayor about the failures of public education. And it was just interesting because the brother didn't realize that the mayor has relatively very little control over public education, and that's something that you got to really engage your state level officials. So if you could just say a little bit about, just as it relates specifically for Black people, like why it's important for us to watch the Statehouse and local policy.
Great question, Dayvon, and thank you for that. I will take that as a springboard into some advocacy that I'm doing right now to make sure that we have a hybrid elected school board. There's going to be a bill forthcoming from Senator Joe Carter and Delegate Melissa Wells to support or to ensure that we have a hybrid elected school board, which would mean that there is a majority of elected seats versus appointed seats. And what's important about that bill is a couple of things. One, it's going to propose that our school board members get some pay, which means that everyday people in Baltimore City have a viable option of serving on this school board, and that it's not, relegated to just elites who have the free will or the time and resources to be able to put the hours into the school board. We are looking to make sure that our student commissioner has full voting rights, that their voices are not marginalized and they're not just being pat on the head or on the school board, kind of as figureheads as opposed to fully participating members. And then also that the elections are publicly financed. So we don't have corporate dollars or other special interests flooding the school board elections with money so that there are people on the school board who vote the way that they want them to vote. So, when it comes to the state house versus local elections versus national elections, oftentimes people feel like they have to choose. We know our state houses across this country were set up to exclude us from the state house. And part of me, I have to always say when I am in front of an audience that I am very grateful to the Susquehannock Lenape tribe for being stewards of land that was surreptitiously taken from them. But for their stewardship, we would not have this healthy land to sit on in Baltimore City. So I'm grateful for them. But the state houses across this country were set up for us not to be in there. We might have worked in the outhouse, we might have worked in kitchens, but we were not intended to be inside of the state houses and making legislation. And oftentimes people are put in a position where they don't understand which elected officials are working on their behalf. So because of long-term corruption, long-term underfunding of our public schools, because of the property tax schematic where property taxes are the main resources for funding schools, which in my opinion is unconstitutional, and in my expertise as a lawyer is unconstitutional. So it's not just my opinion. We have a situation where Baltimore City schools have been in and out of control of state legislation. And so right now it is up to the state of Maryland to determine what kind of funding comes to Baltimore City schools. Baltimore City government contributes not a lot to public education. And so, it's important for us to be in the places where laws are being made. I can't tell you enough, and this, people don't go to Annapolis, and there's no public transportation to Annapolis, and that is intentional. They don't want for people to be able to sit in their hearing rooms and say, my children should or should not be going back to school because the buildings are in disrepair and we have a pandemic in front of us, right? They don't want people to be protesting in front of the governor's mansion or in front of the state house unless somebody put money together to send buses to Annapolis, or people put money together to get some vans to go down to Annapolis. And that's not democracy. So it's really important for folk to, pay attention what's going on at the school board, what's going on in City Hall, what's going on at the Statehouse and what's going on in federal government. If nothing else, we've seen this year how important it is to pay attention to all of those things, that it's not that you have to make a choice. You need to be vigilant and well-versed, because you also want change to happen that you know is best for your community. And if you're railing against the mayor about what the school board is doing, and all they do is appoint school board commissioners, but the financing for schools comes from Annapolis, and every time you see your delegate or senator, you just smile and give them a hug because they came around to your neighborhood block party, but you're not demanding from them the type of schools that your children deserve, then that allows us to continue to be marginalized and really obstructs our ability to have practice self-determination and to move towards Black liberation, which is never going to come from the government. But at a minimum, you got to be there or be square. If you're not in the place where people are making laws about your lives, or at least watching on public access television, whatever the case may be, you put yourself in a position where people will always take. And then when they give you just a little bit, it feels like they gave you a lot when they really gave you nothing.
So let me ask you, because, I think this issue of elected school boards is something that's been around for a while. And one of the things that I'm curious to hear is, because to me, it sounds pretty straightforward. You elect, the idea of electing people who are in positions of power to determine the distribution of major resources, the nature of education works. I mean, what's the major arguments made by those who are opponents of elected school boards?
Oh, boy. Well, let me start off by saying we have actually an amazing superintendent in Baltimore City Schools. When I was running a school, I had 7 superintendents in 10 years. So Sonia Santelises is, we really do have an excellent CEO. But what we hear from people is we have a new mayor, and the new mayor should be allowed to pick his school board. What's that have to do with democracy? This is not, because you won the prize, you get to do whatever you want. That's not democratic, and that's not about people. The other piece is, the CEO needs to have a school board that's supportive of them. Como? That's not democracy. They should be able to work with their school board, but they're not besties. And to date, I have not seen any school commissioner, as long as I've lived in Maryland for 26 years now, I've never seen a school board member held accountable either for not showing up or not doing their committee work or being corrupt in another part of their lives. So the fact that there's no clear accountability for them, and yet we have people saying things like, well, the school board needs to be partners and work well and be supportive of the CEO. What if we have a CEO that turns out to be incompetent? Like, we don't make rules or we don't make policy based on individuals. And that includes individuals who are doing a good job. That's right. Right? We make policies based on what's good for the public. And the idea that the Board of School Commissioners is supposed to be kumbaya with the CEO at all times, and that the Board of School Commissioners doesn't have accountability to the general public. And the idea that people are being told, well, if you don't like the Board of School Commissioners, you can elect a new mayor. Come on now. We're going to elect a new mayor because somebody has a problem with a decision of a group of people who are not elected? I don't think so. And that is really treating people like they're dumb. So, previously the schematic was folk wanted to, there was a lot of relationship between previous leadership in the union that's no longer there. There was a lot of, we really want to be able to decide what the school board is doing and that they should not rock the boat. We've had members of our delegation who would legislate based on what the mayor wants. Well, if the mayor likes that, then that's what we're doing. If the mayor doesn't like that, that's what they're doing. That is problematic, and it is not democracy. It is not what we elect them for, or why we send them to Annapolis. So you hear a lot of people saying things like, I'm progressive, I'm progressive, I'm progressive. So at this point, I want to smack people who say that, because I'm like, do you know what that actually means? Just because you're not a moderate or centrist doesn't mean you're progressive. And, too frequently people want to supplement their voice for the voices of community members. And it's like, no, don't supplement. People can speak for themselves, and they'll speak by going to the ballot box to determine whether or not you should be making decisions for their children. And they should be able to decide if they want to sit and make choices for their children. And what we see in Baltimore, because of our primary system of closed elections, it's very difficult for people who are not a part of the political establishment to represent their community. And, that is intentional. People don't relinquish power even when they look like you. And all our skin folk and our kinfolk, and we've had a lot of skin folk in office, padding their coffers, supporting developers, unwilling to rock the boat because they just want to be reelected, instead of informing the general public about what laws are being made for them or making laws with them, so that people want to see them in office because they know they're working on their behalf. Instead, they play hide the ball with people and don't engage them in the electoral process. Our Democratic Central Committee has only gotten live in the last year or two. In the last year or two, since Delegate Stephanie Smith has taken leadership in the Baltimore delegation, first time we've had a functioning Facebook page, a website that we can see what the delegation is doing, Zoom meetings into the delegation hearings before we even got into the pandemic. So we do have folk who are working for the people, but it's surely not enough, because, we can't wait on our schools to improve. And that's to your question, and I'll wrap it up here. We have heard some people saying, well, it's not broken right now. The school board's working just fine. And I'm like,
for who?
Fine for whom? Is that right? We have children who are at national rates, passing math and English assessments, going to college at the rates of other people without having to acquire large amounts of debt. We have educators who are functioning at the top of their class. We have schoolhouses that are modern and befitting of the children that we send to them. I don't think so. And a part of our issue is, for too long, we've been functioning with good enough. Well, this is what we can get from our elected officials. And they gave us a couple million more dollars, so that's good. But then we don't turn and look at Larry Hogan and say, how is it that all these brand new roads are being built around your businesses across the state of Maryland, but we can't get a red line that takes people from Baltimore to jobs that will allow them to have family sustaining wages. So it really is a matter of making sure you see that the man behind the curtain is actually no one, and that people behind the curtain, what they're doing are making deals to keep themselves in power and keep themselves enriched.
So I'm going to ask a legislative question about that quickly, but just want to add a little bit to what you were saying, because I think a part of, and this is probably something we can, spend an entire piece on, just the way that so-called progressives in many respects will resist the notion of community making decisions for itself out of a paternalism, this idea that, we know better than the community. We know the Black people better than they know themselves, kind of thing. And so I see the effort around elected school boards as a nod toward the notion that the community, does have the ability to govern itself and push itself in the direction away from people who think they can kind of chart our progress forward. So I think that's an important part, just in terms of additional context. So in terms of a legislative question about this issue, and then we'll probably do a few more of the issues that you had mentioned you wanted to raise. So in terms of that particular bill, what committee is it in? And are there folks whom the general public need to pressure? Anybody on any of the committee that the bill is coming through, both on the House and Senate side? If you can tell us like the posture that it's in legislatively.
So the bill hasn't come yet out of the Department of Legislative Services, DLS. And for the folk watching, DLS is the entity that receives bills drafted by legislators to make sure they understand what the budget implications are, to make sure that it's reconciled against any existing laws, to make sure it's not violating Constitution on its face. So it is still with DLS. It will likely go to EHE, which is the Economic Health and Education Committee.
Environment, Health, and Education.
Environment, Health, and Education Committee. Okay, and then on the other side, it is the
Transportation, Environment, and
it might be Ways and Means on the other side. So You know, let me say this. You need to pressure a few people. There's something that happens with our legislators in the Statehouse where if something is specific to your jurisdiction, other legislators will yield to the will of your delegation. Okay, so don't spend a lot of time in Montgomery County and Prince George's County and Wicomico trying to get those elected officials to make sure Baltimore City has a hybrid elected school board. And let me reiterate that Baltimore City is the only jurisdiction out of 23 that does not have an elected member on its school board and does not compensate in any way, whether it's pay or full reimbursement. Baltimore City is the only one that doesn't have it. Okay. Senator Ferguson, who is the head of the Senate. So he is not only the senator from District 46 in Baltimore City, he is our Senate leader. And also Delegate Adrian Jones is the leader of the House. We want to make sure that folk like Maggie McIntosh, who leads Ways and Means and other appropriations, excuse me. I keep bouncing back and forth. But Delegate McIntosh, other members of the delegation who haven't come forward about this. We've had great support from Delegate Smith, Delegate Wells, Delegate Chanel Branch, who is a grandparent and parent of Baltimore City school children, and Stephanie Smith is a parent of Baltimore City school children. You want to make sure that all of our delegation is on board in support of this. It is nonsensical to say there is no reason for us to have elected school board members because they're in other places it doesn't work. Typically in other places it doesn't work because there's not public financing and corporate dollars and special interest dollars do flood those races. We are asking for it to be publicly financed only, and also that the election happens only in the general election. We don't want to disenfranchise anybody who's an independent voter from being able to weigh in on who should be on the school board. And so the goal is to have that election be the general election so anybody can vote for school board members. And then we're also asking for there to be a staggered start of these elected seats. So not that there's a flood in 2022 of elected officials, but over time they are staggered in so that when there's a new election, they will be staggered out and not all rolling in and rolling out at the same time. But you want to talk to the Senate Majority Leader, Bill Ferguson. I'm going to speak to the Leader of the House, Adrian Jones. And you want to make sure the Baltimore delegation is on board. So the first stop you have is your own senator of your district and the delegates who are in your district. And if you need to find out who those folk are, you can easily go online to the Maryland General Assembly, put your address in, it'll tell you who your elected officials are.
Absolutely. So you want to, so I remember there were two other issues you wanted to raise. You want to raise those and then we'll switch and I'll talk about some of
And let me also say one more thing. Right now, most people know the Board of School Commissioners does not respond to public comment. So you may hear people say, people can come to the school board whenever they want and talk to us. And you're talking into a black hole because they don't comment on public comment. And the public comment section is probably 30 minutes long and people have 3 minutes to speak. So don't go for the banana in the tailpipe. And if you have school board members who are saying, this is fine and we don't need this to change, you should ask yourself who they're working for and whether or not it's you and your children. So a couple of other things I want to talk about relates to women's health and also HBCUs. You know, Larry Hogan vetoed the bill that was passed in the 2020 legislative session that would provide equitable resources to our 4 Maryland HBCUs, which was unconscionable. This has been a 12 to 14 year process of trying to make sure our HBCUs are treated fairly. And it is time for this legislative session to move forward on overriding the veto that Larry Hogan instituted last summer after the session ended. Want to make sure there are 3 bills I want to lift up as well. One is House Bill 0205, which provides menstrual hygiene products for young people who menstruate in schools. This would ensure that there are free menstrual hygiene products in all public schools in the state of Maryland. Should not be something that students have to have embarrassment for, should not have to pay the menstruation tax, because these are products that probably should not be taxed at all. But we want to make sure our young people have access to these, especially young people who may be living in poverty, and it's just something that families can't afford to replenish readily. The other thing is related to that. It is SJ 005. Comprehensive Health Education Program. Again, this is about monthly cycle tracking for adolescents who menstruate. And I am saying that intentionally. If you look up the bill, it's going to say female monthly cycle tracking for adolescent girls, but this bill is about people who menstruate, and wanting to make sure that our public schools are providing appropriate education about what it means to have your cycle, how to track it, how to use technology to make sure you know it's coming. And again, these are ways that young women and other people who menstruate can be pushed out of school. We talk about school to prison pipeline, but there's really a school to confinement pipeline where people who menstruate and people who identify as girls and young women, they experience life differently because of their biology. And this is one of those things that we should be teaching regularly to make sure our young women have all the tools necessary and make sure people who menstruate have all the tools necessary, whether or not they identify as girls. Last but not least is House Bill 0189, Mobile Laundry for the Homeless Pilot Program. And this would establish the Mobile Laundry for the Homeless Pilot Program in the Division of Neighborhood Revitalization. And it would provide for the purpose of the pilot program requiring the division to administer certain grants so that there are mobile laundry services for the homeless and establishing certain eligibility requirements. So we just want to make sure that folk are taken care of. These are things that, people will be in Annapolis talking about defund and abolish the police. People will be talking about other things. One other point I wanted to make was the bill that Hogan did a veto of to provide supports for women who were formerly incarcerated and transitioning back into community. He vetoed the legislation that passed that would provide specialized support for women who are returning citizens. So, we've had a governor who's not been friendly to people who aren't rich. He has placed profit over people, and we want to make sure that both when it comes to the health and hygiene of our young people, of people who menstruate, of women who are returning home, and of homeless people, that our elected officials are passing legislation that allows them a level of humanity that they deserve.
Yeah, but that's really important. I'm assuming,
that was a mouthful.
And I mean, I'm hoping, because those pieces of legislation sound like things that shouldn't be particularly controversial in terms of getting them passed. So, we'll definitely make sure we come back to those and make sure that they sail smoothly through the legislature. So what I
want to hear from you. What bills should people be looking out that are on your radar that you are constantly in Annapolis? LBS is constantly in Annapolis, doggedly. People don't like when you show up in their hearing rooms because it's like it's about to go down. But what things are you looking at?
Absolutely. So what I'm gonna do is there are two kind of small pieces that I want to throw out there just so folks know we're paying attention, and then really the policing stuff is the place where I'm going to spend a lot of time. First, I want to shout out brother Jabari Natur out of Conscious Head. So this is actually something, I was getting a haircut, we were talking, and he was telling me about the work that he's doing about trying to expand his barbering boot camp. And one of the things that gets in the way of that is that the current law was that you can only apprentice one barber per master barber at a time. So he wanted to expand it so that he can actually do a series of classes to bring more barbers in, because it's an opportunity, it's a workforce opportunity, it's a craft. And so, we would just kind of talk. I was like, well, we can just change that. We can just, go. And so, so we had a bill put in a couple of years ago I think this was 2019. And one of the major obstacles was the state board, because there's a financial interest in making it so streamlined. They're like these expensive schools that, charge people like 10 grand to go through in order to get their license and get the, and so what ended up happening was the bill actually passed, but they disputed the language, whether or not it actually counted for their ability to apprentice people to their full licensure. So we went back this year, and Delegate Stephanie Smith, who you mentioned, who's also the chair of the Baltimore City delegation, is going to put that bill in. It hasn't dropped yet, so we don't have a bill number. But I just wanted to mention that bill. It should sail through the General Assembly, not very controversial. And again, just wanted to shout out, Brother Jabari, just an example of something small, but that can make a big difference in terms of workforce opportunities and just expanding, the brand of Conscious Heads, which is really about bringing people to consciousness about our culture and community and whatnot, and giving people a skill. The other relatively small piece of legislation we're working on, partnering with Gabe Severo around HB.4, which is essentially a bill that establishes a task force to look at culture, history, and civics in public education. And it's a task force, so it's really about just convening folks to really look through that. There are a lot of folks, and I think, you and I agree that one of the deficiencies in the Kerwin bill is the question of really looking comprehensively at the nature of the kind of education that young people receive in a way that is truly culturally informed and empowering and the like. So the hope is for this bill to establish this commission such that we can start to then make legislative recommendations to that end, to really complete the work that I think Kerwin was beginning. And that hearing is in a couple of weeks. So stay tuned. We'll post some legislative updates about that. So we really want to get into the policing piece. This is kind of the big kind of national issue that, has local implications. And this is an issue that LBS has been working on for many years at this point. There are a variety of different elements of it, but there are two major pieces that LBS is particularly focused on. And we're a part of a larger statewide coalition that's working on these issues. But the two primary pieces that are the heavy lifts, and that is the changes to the Maryland Public Information Act and the repeal of the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. And what I want to do is kind of, because the big picture piece in terms of what we want to do with policing, there's often, I think, a mistake, conceptual mistake that is made in terms of how policing is talked about in the mainstream. And what I mean by that is that I think in many instances, policing is talked about from the vantage point of how do we get the police to stop mistreating us? And I actually think that's not the appropriate frame. The appropriate frame is how do we build in mechanisms that allow the community to exercise control over the institution of law enforcement? Because it's only then that there are true deterrents of the kind of police abuses that have been pretty extensively documented at this point. And so I'll start with the Maryland Public Information Act because it's pretty straightforward. Currently, the internal affairs investigatory records of police officers are considered personnel files. And because they're considered personnel files, there are three different categories within the Maryland Public Information Act. There are, so just, for folks who aren't familiar with Public Information Act requests, you can make public information requests, of government agencies. They're obligated to provide information, and the information that they're required to give is in this matrix that I'm about to lay out, where there are some things that are required disclosures. If it's requested, you're required to get that information. There's the category of may disclose, discretionary disclosures, right? So the agency can determine what things it gets to disclose or not. And then there's the may not disclose that are prohibited from public disclosure. Currently, the files for investigation of police officers are in the do not disclose category. So what we're advocating for is for the internal affairs investigatory files of police officers to be put in the discretionary disclosures, right? Where the agency heads would get the ability to determine, what kinds of information wouldn't be able to be disclosable, but they would have to, have a justification for why they're not disclosing the information that's being provided. And that's particularly important because a part of the problem is a lot of the incidences that has led to police killings or brutality, many of the officers involved have had a track record of that kind of behavior, but that information is prohibited from public disclosure. One of the things that there has been disputes about, because we've been involved for the past couple of years in some of the kind of legislative negotiations around that. And the major difference between our position and that of leadership, particularly in the House, and we'll get to later on, is that there are two kind of catch-all categories of investigations of police officers, sustained and unsustained. So sustained is they investigated and there's some they found that there's some veracity to what was accused and some action that should take place. And unsustained is them designated. There's no reason to take any action. The leadership, particularly the House, they've been willing to give us the sustained complaints, the ones where the police office, the internal affairs and the chief thought that there was something there to discipline an officer. They don't want to give us the unsustained. And this is the place where there's a major disagreement, because we believe that those unsustained complaints are also important. Because if you read both the Department of Justice report of 2016 and the report that just recently came out, that I really encourage people to read. It's long, but I think it's very informative. It was a task force that Senator Ferguson, before he was Senate president, a bill he put in to do a study, the Restoring Trust and Policing Commission. And it released its report that also found that much of the investigations in the unsustained category were the kinds of investigations that, if made public, folks would have thought that those things were worthy of further action, right? And in fact, the sustains only really give us, maybe 8 to 10% of the total complaints.
So would you say, or what people would see would be that the unsustained complaints, when you string them together, make clear a part and practice of particular officers who are abusing their role as officers?
Exactly. And what we get told by law enforcement is one of the biggest things that they say is that, people will make false allegations of officers, and that if those false allegations are made public, then they will discredit police officers. They've tried to spin this narrative because there was a hearing on this bill, and it's Anton's Law, which is named after Anton Black, who was killed on the Eastern Shore by law enforcement over there a couple of years ago. And one of the things that we have had to make very clear, because what the propaganda on the other side will say is that this bill would just open the floodgates and everything would be disclosable, right? And in fact, our proposal compared to what's being advocated for around the country is fairly moderate, because in other places, they are advocating that all of these records be put in the must disclose category. We're essentially saying that they're put in the discretionary disclosures, because there are legitimate reasons why you don't want to disclose certain information. If there's an ongoing investigation, you don't want to disclose information about that. If there are personal medical information involved, there's certain things that are reasonably things that you would not disclose, in a file. And so that's what the other side is saying, is they're saying that, that you're going to open the floodgates, you're going to discredit, police officers that would be otherwise good people, and you're going to have people making, and that doesn't mean that people don't make false allegations. But what we're saying is that we now have a dearth of empirical evidence, both, again, the DOJ report, the new report from the commission that I mentioned earlier, and a variety of other reports that give us the information we need to know that within that unsustained category, there's much more cause for concern that those instances of brutality and misconduct are being missed, more so than any evidence we have that there's going to be this plethora of false allegations.
We have a gun trace task force.
Exactly.
We have a community leader who was initially wrapped up in the legal system, who just lost his life a week or so ago because of members of the gun trace task force who were subsequently shown to be corrupt on top of corrupt, and then corrupt again. So we have plenty of evidence on why we would want to make sure that these things are made disclosed. And I think in some ways it sounds like opponents are treating the general public like we're idiots, right? Like, you can't possibly decipher between one case of an otherwise good officer versus an officer having 15 different people saying, they robbed me last week, or there's a pattern of how they, enter people's homes in ways that they're looking for things to plant or to claim that a crime was committed when there wasn't one. So, you can't say that the public ought to trust the police when you're saying to us we're not intelligent enough to know the difference between somebody that has a fishy claim against an officer one time versus a string of them, or something that you see as unsubstantiated that we are saying, well, we have more info from the general public and other witnesses seem to take a different position. So let's move forward on this case.
Yep. And the last thing I'll say on it before, I get to LEOBR is that, one of the things that I'm clear about is that, prosecutors, one of the person who testifies a lot against much of the stuff that we put forward is a gentleman named Scott Schellenberger, who I don't know if he's still the president of the Maryland Association of State's Attorneys, but at one point he's the Baltimore County State's Attorney. And one of the things that I'm clear about in listening to his testimony and in some of my conversations with Chairman Clippinger, which we'll talk more about later in the program, is that the prosecutors see police as a way to get convictions, right? That's the primary thing they're thinking about. And to me, what's problematic about that is that folks seem more willing to protect the reputation of police officers and securing convictions to deal with the very real issue of homicide, as opposed to, because one of the things that this new report that I just mentioned came out, a legislatively commissioned report, it says that the majority of the folks from whom they surveyed, residents, and I want to be clear, the residents that they surveyed, they found that many of them either had neutral or favorable ideas of police, right? So these aren't folks that are being surveyed that have a bias against police. They found that they felt that if they had more information and transparency about policing, that they would be more willing to cooperate. But as it stood, they don't trust police because a majority of them had experienced law enforcement behaving in ways that were problematic, right? And so one of the things that we have put forward, there's a public safety argument to the Maryland Public Information Act, which is people who like police don't trust the police, right? And so if you don't provide the transparency, then it undermines folks' willingness to cooperate with police in the instances when we're talking about violence and homicide, where there is a role to be played by them in the current system that we're in.
So, Dayvon, before you go on to the LEOBR, will you let folk know where they can find the Restoring Trust in Police report?
So what I'll do, Adam, if you search it, because I know it's on the Maryland General Assembly website somewhere where they have the list of reports, because it was a legislatively commissioned report. So if you could find that there and then post a link, you'll be able to find it where all the other legislative commission reports are. So Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights. This one is fairly complicated, but the gist of it is that this is an instance where police officers as employees of the government, their rights as employees have been structured in such a way by the LEOBR that undermine the ability to have transparency and accountability. There are two major examples that I'll give in the LEOBR, the Law Enforcement Officer Bill of Rights, that undermine the ability for there to be true accountability. The first example, I think it's a good example to really give people a scope of the problem, is that as the LEOBR is currently constructed, only sworn law enforcement can participate in the investigation of an officer engaged in misconduct. So the police are essentially controlling the information about investigations about their peers, right? And that is by law. So that's one piece. The other is that it limits the ability for community non-law enforcement officials to participate in the disciplining of law enforcement. And And so again, police are essentially policing themselves. And so what the LEOBR does is that it shifts power of accountability into the hands of police to be able to police themselves. Just, I think some historical context I think is really important, because it was codified in 1974. And this was around the time of the disclosures of the counterintelligence program, from which the federal government collaborated with local law enforcement to disrupt leftist and liberation movements. And so local law enforcement played a role in that. So you think about someone like Eddie Conway here in Baltimore, who was a part of the Black Panther Party chapter in Baltimore City, who was victimized by this counterintelligence program by local law enforcement. And I think that context is important because you think about all of the protections that the LEOBR provides. In many respects, what we'll hear from the other side is they're talking about the rights of police officers as government employees. We argue that the balance is too skewed to the side of law enforcement in their protections. And there's a way in which the skewing of those protections creates a dynamic where police officers are able to engage in these acts of corruption, knowing that the procedure that's laid out is structured in such a way where the public doesn't have access to the information and the public can't participate in real discipline. It's actually one of the things that, you think about the fact that Baltimore City has a civilian review board, but it doesn't have the power to do discipline, and it doesn't have access to all the things it needs to properly do it. In addition to the fact that it needs more resources. But that's really, just in a nutshell, some of the things we're dealing with the LEOBR. And so what we're advocating for is the repeal of the LEOBR, but we're also advocating some language to replace what's currently there. And the reason why that's important is because if you read the collective bargaining contracts of around the different jurisdictions in Maryland, you will see some of the language of the LEOBR replicated in their contracts. So a part of what we're looking to do in terms of what to replace it with is a kind of a statewide standard of discipline that provides due process rights to law enforcement officers, but also ensures that there is some accountability. And so what you'll see in our proposal is one where police chiefs actually have more power than they currently do now, because currently police chiefs are battling with the FOP in many respects. The trial boards, if a chief gives discipline, that officer can appeal to a trial board. And the Fraternal Order of Police, this is a place where they're able to exercise power, right? Because they're able, through their membership, to essentially rebut the discipline handed down by a chief. So a chief can say, well, I tried to discipline him, but the trial boards overturned it. I can't do anything about it. We're advocating that the chief is able to have more ability to dispense discipline, very similar to other state employees. So again, you still get your due process rights, right? But there's a person to be held accountable. And then the other part of the bill that's really important is that it allows for local jurisdictions through a local ordinance to establish an oversight body that is empowered to both engage in discipline and be involved in the investigation of misconduct. So that's the language we're looking to replace so repealing the LEOBR and then replace it with those major aspects.
So it's interesting because I think for the years that LBS has been involved and those before, I don't know who was involved before LBS has really been proponents or opponents of the LEOBR, but people hear law enforcement officers' Bill of Rights and misunderstand it is increasing their rights above and beyond what everybody else's constitutional rights are.
That's right.
So they hear it and they're like, I support law enforcement. Yes, there should be a law enforcement officer's Bill of Rights. They should have rights. They're here to protect us. They put their lives on the line. But what people need to be clear about is that LEOBR is not offering rights that protect law enforcement, as it relates to their safety and as it relates to, making sure they have the right amount of benefits and that kind of thing. It is to give them more rights than everyday people have when they commit crimes or break laws. Mm-hmm. So, it's things like if you commit a crime, You don't get to go home for a couple of weeks, discuss with your attorney what you're going to tell people about the crime that was committed, or decide whether or not you have this group of people, in their case it's the Fraternal Order of Police, who get to say, well, you know, we're going to go on camera and make you look like bad people if you try to hold this person accountable. That is what the LEOBR does for law enforcement. Beyond the fact that the general public cannot hold them accountable or participate in their review and do it with any teeth, it is giving them additional rights above and beyond the average person who commits a crime. We're not talking about rights in the case that they need help. It is in the case they have done wrong. They have additional rights over and beyond people who have got caught up in the war on drugs, or, you know, the war on communities, because it wasn't actually a war on drugs, right? You know, when we think about the rights that we have or have been held against us, LEOBR seeks to remove police from accountability in ways that the rest of us are accountable if we break the law.
Yeah. And one thing, and this actually transitioned us to just some general conversation, just about just some of the legislative dynamics. Is policing is one of those big ticket issues this session. And, you know, one of the things that's really clear to me is that one of the things that actually undergirds some of the folks that share some of the anxieties that you expressed that the other side would have is there's some people that really have in their minds have valorized the notion of police officers as like this kind of exceptional group of people. And there are folks who really believe that. And I think that's particularly important for two reasons. One, I think it devalues the way in which many of us put our lives on the line in a variety of ways in service to our community, right? And that's not to say that police officers don't, you know, do that in their work, but to elevate them in the way that I think they've been elevated in a lot of people's minds really does a disservice to the work that folks are doing in the communities every day to address the issues of violence and the like in our communities. But the other piece that I think is important about that is that I think a part of what that notion does is that it renders in many respects almost invisible much of the pain and suffering that a lot of Black folks and other folks of color who experience police abuses, you know, on a regular basis. Like, I think, unfortunately, it's only when a person gets killed that that it triggers people's attention and imagination, or if you happen to see something on video. But there are lots of people that experience police abuse pretty regularly. And again, this is why the reports that have come out, particularly the DOJ report, one of the reasons why it was so compelling, because it wasn't just the issues of people being killed. One of the examples I use a lot is one of the examples it has about a gentleman for whom over a period of several weeks was strip searched by an officer in a particular area of town and was told, every time you come, this is what's going to happen, right? And they complained about it, filed a complaint, and the police department ruled it a unsustained complaint, even though the description of the officer matched what he said, where the officer was stationed, all the things matched, but it was an unsustained complaint. And so, you know, one of the things that so this idea of elevating police officers kind of above everyone else in terms of how they're valorized, for me, this is the part of
I apologize for interrupting. Mm-hmm. You know who else that causes a problem for? Officers who are doing the right thing.
That's right.
So many men and women go into law enforcement thinking, I'm going to protect my community. I would guarantee you 75%, if I had to pick a number, do not believe they're going into a cult or a gang where when you see someone doing the wrong thing to your neighbors, it is your job to protect that person, or else you'll have dead rats put on your doorstep or on your vehicle, or your animal killed, or you have to leave town from a community you grew up in because supposedly you're a rat or a snitch. Mm-hmm. The LEOBR puts good is a hard thing to say for me, but puts good people who chose this profession into a predicament where they can't be good people. Right. So this whole idea of one bad apple spoil the bunch. No, the system is the bad apple. So good people enter a system that requires them to treat everyday people and to treat their neighbors like criminals and subhuman. And, you know, this all is wrapped up into white supremacy and the genesis of police, because the genesis of police were to capture enslaved people and bring them back to their property owners. But, you know, it does make it difficult for these supposed good cops to be good cops, because they're in a system that says you are not allowed to be a good human and say, my G, so you can't be stripping this guy every time he comes into the neighborhood. Because the moment you even intimate, you see the problem, you are now on watch. Nobody wants to work with you. Nobody has your back when you're working the street. Nobody wants to speak up for you when they saw somebody, you know, do something wrong, I don't know, in one of your shifts. So now you're the problem when you were just saying, we don't treat people like that. Human beings don't get stripped every time they enter a certain 5-block radius. And so the fact that the FOP ardently, stridently, aggressively supports the LEOBR without any acknowledgement that it places their own membership in a position to not treat people like humans, because they themselves are at risk for some very, very dangerous activities against them and their families, doesn't make sense.
Yeah. And going on that particular piece around the way that our communities are criminalized, right? And how, because a part of how one could justify these insular institutional practices that keep the public out, you would have to be a person that believes that Black folks in our communities are inherently criminal. Correct. Right? And it takes a special kind of, you know, force to, you know, it's like that, the thin blue line. Right. The idea that they're the line between civilization and uncivilized, and that there's a racialized component to that. So even I wrote a piece that appeared in Maryland Matters a couple of weeks ago, you know, around the notion of race neutrality. And I used, you know, Chairman Lou Clippinger. He's out of Baltimore City, and out of the 46th district in Baltimore City. And a part of, you know, the general point that I make there is that, you know, you have, I think, in the national environment, and it trickles down to Maryland, a desire for politics to move more left, right? More explicit calls for racial justice as the part of, as an essential piece of how policy is made. And I remember when he was appointed the chair of that committee being disappointed, not particularly because of anything about him, because at the time I didn't know him, you know, I had only maybe talked to him once or twice. But it was really about the notion of having a person who was, you know, affirmatively committed to racial justice to lead that committee, being that Maryland is a third Black, 15% Latinx. I think majority of the children now in Maryland are folks of color. And so, you know, it's an environment where you would want a person that has an explicit lens and worldview around racial justice. And so, you know, but I would, you know, willing to work with them. Right. Willing to engage them just like we would any other legislator. And, you know, one of the things that has become frustrating is that one of the tactics that I learned very early on of liberals and Democrats, particularly in Maryland, is the tactic of pushing policy when it comes to racial justice that gives the appearance of some forward movement, but actually doesn't change the power differential such that it empowers the community. And if we look at the Maryland Public Information Act as an example of that, you know, that we talked about a few minutes ago, you know, it being a policy where these investigatory records are disclosed, right? Because it gives, you know, law enforcement officials ability to have this information away from the public that gives them the power to ability to engage in these behaviors, knowing that there aren't going to be any consequences for their actions. And one of the things that I know is that, you know, Chairman Clippinger is a prosecutor in Anne Arundel County, and I'm sure he's using a lens that comes out of the lens of prosecutors who now, I think, in the environment of criminal justice conversations, have been criticized for the way in which race neutrality is a central piece as to how they do their practice of prosecution. And so I think the pushback around the reputation of police officers, for instance, right? To me, not recognizing, one, as we talked about before, how police are valorized, but also how Black folks are criminalized, right? That, you know, people, as Black people, you know, we're constantly having to prove in many respects that we're not criminal, right? That's the kind of default position in many of the posture that we have to occupy. So I raised a conversation because there's some people that I think have a hard time with this notion that, because like I said, you know, most of my interactions with Chairman Clippinger have been good. Like personally, I've never had a negative experience with him, right?
I have, but I digress.
But, you know, but it's one of those things where, you know, and one of the things that we try to make clear to people is it's not about personality, right? It's about the worldview that he comes from, which is a worldview that is ubiquitous in the General Assembly, right? So it's not exclusive to him. He just happens to be chair of a committee from which that worldview has major implications. And so, you know, so again, I'm bringing it up because I think it's important for people to be able to understand that the way that white supremacy operates as a system doesn't necessarily require people being assholes or being mean, but it requires a worldview. And in this case, a worldview of race neutrality, right? That doesn't acknowledge the way in which race is endemic to the policies that he's presiding over as chair of that very important committee.
I mean, I hope this conversation is broadly viewed, not just in Baltimore City, but across the state of Maryland. This applies to, you know, Latinx people as well. So Latino men in Montgomery County and Prince George's County, Anne Arundel County, new Americans in general, so immigrants who are in this state, and how law enforcement engages with them and their humanity is also tied up into the worldview of the people who are in these positions. I brought up Maggie McIntosh before as it related to elected school board, is because she's been an opponent of an elected school board almost all of the time that this has been advocated for. And, you know, similarly to Luke Clippinger, people like Maggie McIntosh. And she's one of those people you talk to, you know, folksy, one of us, but holds a worldview and positionality about legislation that is quite paternalistic and quite in the stance of, I know better than you do. Of course, I work for the people. Of course, I think race is important. They will say the right things when it comes to race. But in terms of the policy they put forward is very much, you know, we know better than you do.
And you know, real quick, because one thing, just to give you an example, right? Because, you know, I was told about a conversation that Chairman Clippinger had with someone who was essentially making the argument that I was making about the version of MPIA, that the Maryland Public Information that he was pushing out last session, which essentially focused mostly on the sustained. Right? The only unsustained we got is if someone was killed or serious bodily injury, right? Which for us, or discharge of a firearm, which for us, that's not enough. There's so much more that we need when we talk about abuse that happens in our community. And so what he did towards the end of session was add an amendment. And what this amendment did was it allowed for the disclosure of unsustained complaints if a person had more than 2 complaints over the period of a year, and it would be reviewed by a trial board where there would be 1 civilian. And then if that trial board determined that there was some truth to those complaints, then it would be disclosed. And for me, and so a part of, because I even noticed on the Maryland Matters article, there was an editor's note that said that the bill that hit the floor actually allowed for unsustained complaints. No, so this goes back to what I was saying before about the trick of liberals and how, because one could say with that amendment, technically, unsustained complaints were disclosable, but the mechanisms put in place for their disclosure, right, would have only disclosed about 7% of the unsustained, right? So it's the ability to say in some context, I did the thing, but putting something in there that appeases what I
Same
think
with
is
the elected school board. We have two elected seats coming up in 2020. And so now we're hearing things like, well, let's see how it goes with the 2 elected positions now. What are 2 elected positions going to do when the majority of the board is appointed and the 2 increases the number of people on the board? So it's not taking 2 appointed seats and making them elected seats. It's adding 2 elected seats to the existing number of school board members. You've done nothing for us, right? But the language, just like you said, will be, we heard you. We understand what you want. And so we're right along with you. Let's see how this pilot works out. And it's like, you can't pilot my everyday Blackness of being oppressed and in a system that does not like my children. So let's not wait and see. But exactly the same thing. We have 2 elected seats now. What do you mean? And the average person who's not in Annapolis all the time will say, oh, but I heard that she put 2 elected seats on the board. And added them to the existing number of people, so their voices are moot, right? Who cares if there are 2 new elected positions when they're still the same number of appointed positions? They have no weight when it comes to whose voices are at that table from the public versus appointed by people who may or may not have children in city schools or may or may not have interests that look the same as the people who would be elected but for this process.
So as we move to winding down, and this goes along the lines of what we actually just talked about, because I think one of the questions I get a lot of is, Dayvon, we got new leadership, got a new Speaker of the House, got a new Senate president. So this space opened up, they both seem more progressive than their predecessors. That's a question I get a lot. And what I say to it, when people ask me, is that it's important for people to recognize that individual people in positions of power are never just individuals. These are people that are subject to a myriad of forces that have their ways of being able to encourage or incentivize or disincentivize certain types of behavior, in order to get what they want. And I think a lot of times people underestimate the extent to which, particularly the corporate sector and those with power, are able to use those levers to be able to. And to me, one of the best, there are a bunch of examples. One of the best examples from a couple of years ago is the Johns Hopkins police force. I mean, the way that was just pushed through. And, it just showed you that Hopkins, as the biggest employer in the state, as a major corporate player in the region, right?
The biggest landowners in the state.
Biggest landowners in the state, and the red carpet was just rolled out. Leadership said, this is what we're doing. Now luckily we have a few legislators that were brave enough to push against it. But, leadership, they made that what it was. And so it really showed the power that the corporate sector has. Yeah. But in addition to that, I also worry that with new leadership, I think there are ways in which folks will hide behind that. You know what I mean? And especially, as I mentioned before, a lot of our issues with MPIA and even some of the replacement stuff around LEOBR is in the House leadership, right? And I'm a person who, I was very proud to have Adrian Jones be Speaker of the House. I remember, when it was between Derek Davis and Maggie McIntosh, I remember thinking to myself, like, why wouldn't it naturally be, Adrian Jones having been pro temp for so long? And so I think, but one of the things that concerns me is the way that I can imagine leadership weaponizing that. And to a lesser degree, when you think about the Senate, folks kind of weaponizing, Senator Ferguson's more progressive stance on things to say to us, like, chill out, give
him a chance.
You give him a chance, roll with it. We'll come back and get you. And I just think this is the moment when they're still trying to cement the structure of how they're going to govern. And I just think we have to go hard. Because we have to set the terms such that, because in the past, those of us that have been in Annapolis, the way that it's been is leadership dictates the terms, right? And you might get to negotiate a little bit, but they get to set the terms. And I think we have to end that. I think we have to have an arrangement where then we're truly negotiating. They don't just get to set the terms. We get to also set the terms because these are really big and important issues, and we can't just let leadership, set the terms for how these conversations go.
Well, it can't just be, I know we're talking about the streets to the Statehouse. It's got to be the same for our newly elected city council, our newly elected mayor, our newly elected or relatively new Speaker of the House and Senate President, and for the President of the United States and Vice President of the United States. People cannot turn off their advocacy now because they think, whew, we got through that, my mom made it, that guy's out of office, or we now have a fresh young face who's the Senate President. We now have a sister who's talking about racial equity, who is the Speaker of the House. Okay, and show me the money. And we can't allow for the status quo to be re-entrenched because we're trying to give people a chance. Turn and look to your child and say, I'm gonna give them a chance. So if we don't make it with you, maybe your children will have a better life. Come on, like play that whole thing out, right? The whole give it a chance. I know we don't have transportation from here to where the jobs are, but we're gonna give these people a chance. What? No. So I agree with you wholeheartedly. And that's why, we started the discussion where we did. People can't take their foot off the gas, and they also can't rest on the likability of their elected officials if the legislation is not legislation that makes your life better.
So look, I had a good time. And, and I think, maybe in the future we'll have some guests, and have a more robust conversation. Just want to thank all those who spent their time with us this evening to talk about state level policy. I mean, it's cool because it's almost like we get to nerd out about, state level policy, you know what I'm saying? But see, one of the things I think happens though, is I think people do this thing where they think Black people really won't care about this or watch it if you don't make it available. You know what I'm saying? And so, I think Adam's let me know that we have, had really good viewership over the course of this. If you're watching, share widely. We'll be back in a couple of weeks. This will be a regular thing throughout session. Yep. I want to thank you, Khalilah, for rolling with a brother. Looking forward to doing more of these in the future.
Yep.
You want to say any last words before we bounce?
Just shout out to my sister Charlene Rock, who does her thing with Black Girls Rock. Black Girls Vote, because Black Girls Rock, but she works with Nakidra and the crew over there at Black Girls Vote. It's so important for us to keep the conversation going. Again, people get on me when I'm like, we had to press. I'm not worried about November 3rd. I'm worried about November 4th. I'm not worried about January 20th. I'm worried about January 21st, because we don't have time to relinquish accountability for people who said they were going to do some things. And if we want to get the liberation that we want, we got to keep pressing. Sounds good. Great way to end it. All right, everybody, take care. See you soon. Check us out.